this is kind of two sessions merged into one. So first, I'll talk about what a fantasy console is and how it can improve your creativity and productivity. And then we'll talk about another really fun aspect of fantasy consoles, which is something you can make called tweet carts. So what is a fantasy console? Here is a quote from the creator of PICO-8. It's like a regular console, but without the inconvenience of actual hardware. It's like an 8-bit machine that never was. It has strict limitations as if you're working on old platforms, but you don't have the nightmare of porting old code to all bunch of different machines with different architectures. The three big ones are PICO-8, Pixel Vision 8, and TIC-80. The second two are both free and open sourced, but PICO-8 is by far the biggest, and it was also the first one. And they all have similar limitations, so it will all carry over. So extending the console metaphor, you save your finished game as cartridges. PICO-8 cartridges can be saved as a special PNG format, like this one. And this image contains all the code and all the art and everything for the game. So you could just load this image and it'll give you the fully playable game. You can also easily export games as HTML web player or standalone for Windows, Mac, and Linux. The original version of Celeste was actually made in PICO-8, and it was ported over to Unity afterwards for the full version. PICO-8 has several tools for editing sound, code, music, and sprites built right into the console. So you can create a full game or program in one sitting without ever having to leave this cozy development environment. And it's super simple too. You can just click on everywhere to create things. And here's a quick aside that the PICO-8 community is super awesome because they're helpful and everything in the community is very open. So PICO-8 as a software is proprietary, but you can share your carts on official forums, and once you do that, the carts become open. So you can look at underneath the code and the art behind the scenes, figure out and learn from how all of it works. And even make changes to it and sort of make mods. This PICO-8 cart is actually a corrupted version, which adds some really cool glitchy effects. So these three things, the awesome community, the simple interface, and everything being in one place, makes PICO-8 really good for use in the education space. I don't know a whole lot about that subject though, so that's all I'll mention of it. For some folks, there's also a definite nostalgia that's part of the appeal. Maybe these retro aesthetics bring them back to the first days learning to make things on their own machines. Maybe it makes them long for a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I was born in 1996, so that means nothing to me. Lastly, the main reason you'd want to use a fantasy console is the limitations they provide. Zep says that these harsh constraints are carefully chosen to be fun with work with and encourage small, expressive designs. And they absolutely succeed at that. It's super fun to work with, but doesn't ever really feel unfair or arbitrary. This cheat sheet is basically all the options you have for any code that you make. And even all this, you won't need all at once. So here are the exact specs you have to work with for PICO-8. With other fantasy consoles, they'll be slightly different, but they're all roughly the same with these harsh limitations. You have harsh limits on your resolution, color options, and everything else. The one that will need clarifying here at the bottom is the token count, which is for programming. Any variable of any length is a single unit, a single token. A number or an operator is a token, and it's so on and so forth. It's worth mentioning here, PICO-8 uses Lua, and I think all the other fantasy consoles are compatible with Lua as well. So why bother with these limitations? These constraints kind of are the point, because limiting your toolset is super fun because it leads to interesting challenges, but it can also help you be more creative just by the virtue of being constrained. Limitations fostering creativity is something I kind of think is axiomatic and doesn't need proof, but here I'm going to prove it to you anyway. This could be a limit, could be something like a small tool set, like fantasy consoles, or working inside Minecraft or Roblox. Kids can make incredible things with those. It could also be a limit on your ideas, like giving you a prompt for a game jam or a writing prompt. It could be a limit on time, like you only have 48 hours to do this thing. Asterisk here, crunch is bad and not healthy. Try to avoid sustained crunch wherever possible, especially if you're indie and responsible for yourself. And it can also be something else entirely, like arbitrary rules to follow. One of my favorite diversifier Global Game Jam has is, instead of making a brand new game, you start from someone's game last year and take it in a different direction. Limitations can also lead to very stylized works. When you have to adhere to them, it just makes your work stand out. Finite Reflections Gardener and the Wildvine does this to great effect by mixing 2D sprites with a 3D world, and with a gameplay setup that only makes sense in 3D space because you're moving around on the cylinder. This leads to my next point. Oh, this limitation is self-imposed, but it leads into a super stylized and memorable game. And this leads into my next point, which is, if you follow limitation once, it creates a very stylized single work. But if you continue to follow the same limits, you can develop a consistent and recognizable style for yourself and your own work. Heather Flowers, the creator of Extreme Meat Punks Forever, uses ASCII art for all her backgrounds, and all her characters are very deeply colored with a solid primary color. These are two things that make it instantly recognizable if you're familiar with her work. Another example would be the trademarked hodgepodge aesthetic of the Clutter series. Joe has achieved the franchise effect by having a huge line of games that all benefit from each other, and I think he's had a talk in the past about this subject. The point is, it's helpful to be consistent. Another old mantra you've likely heard is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If you need everything to be perfect before you're done, guess what? You never will be done. Perfection isn't something achievable, but we're compelled to strive for it anyway. Something these limitations do is restrict the fidelity of your game. It's harder in many ways to make small changes. So, like, if you're making a face, and you have to convey a whole face in only 8 pixels, the thinnest you can make anything in there is going to be 1 pixel. So you're likely to reach a point where you can't really change anymore to improve it. Similarly, maybe you have 2 shades of a color, you want to make a gradient, but you don't have to agonize about what shading to use to get something looking right. Maybe instead of agonizing, you change your approach or learn a new technique. With this example, if you only have 2 shades, you could do something like dithering and learn a new technique to get the effect that you want. This ultimately leads to you trying out different and new techniques that you wouldn't have needed to consider if you weren't limited. This means you're learning new ideas and you're growing as a creator. I could end there, but fantasy consoles do a lot more to keep you productive and help make you more faster. A lot of this still has to do with the limitations too. So I'm bringing back up the all-in-one workflow because it's super helpful. You can have everything in just one window and navigate through it intuitively. This is super helpful if you're willing to buy into it because it means you don't have to have Unity open in one window with an code editor in another and maybe like a Blender in another, with reference materials for each and every one of those open on one of the 6 different monitors you have. And it's also worth mentioning that this is optional. If you don't want to code in this 128 window with a 3x5 font, you can absolutely just open the file in your editor of choice and edit it from there. And there are even user-made syntax highlighters out there you can use. It's also super accessible because it can run on any machine, basically, because the limits are so weak. This means that you don't have to have a powerful machine, and if you have something from 2000 flat, you could probably just even use it. These 2 points are worth mentioning because they'll be important to some people, but the rest of these are going to be pretty universally applicable. So a big one is that these environments force you to keep games small, which really helps to fend off scope creep. Scope creep, if you're unaware, is the tendency to add new features to make a game bigger until it's bloated and it's delayed. Here, code and art and sound all become precious resources. Not only does this mean optimization is kind of like a puzzle you have to solve, which is really fun, but at some point you'll just run out of space. You just aren't able to infinitely add new features and content as much as you want. I'll put an asterisk there because we'll come back to this a little later. Another byproduct of the small size is that it's entirely feasible to make something solo. This is my game Pushimo, which just came out, and I finished mostly by myself in just a few months. Working in fantasy consoles also is a lot faster in other environments. This is for a lot of the same reasons that I've already mentioned. Having everything the workflow all in one just means each session you're working faster. Making things small means it takes less time to finish each one, and running on anything means maybe you're out, you have your laptop, you can just get a little bit done in a quick session when you get a chance. Making faster work means you can make more work, which means you can get more practice, and that means you're a better creator. And it's for this exact reason that fantasy consoles are also really great for prototyping. You can easily run through a bunch of ideas, try them out, and experiment and iterate with them super quickly. My game was originally a game jam game, and then I expanded it from there. It's also great for giving you visible progress. Speaking personally, I only really have two reasons for making games. First, I have to feel like I'm making progress, and if I don't feel like I'm getting anything done, I might lose motivation. The combination of everything being super small and fast to develop means that you can always find something to work on to make progress. This is in contrast to other platforms where you have to wait hours just for Visual Studio to open. Next, my monkey brain gives me a rush of serotonin whenever people compliment me or my games. So it's important to me to be able to easily create and share images. With PICO-8, you can easily export these GIFs with a press of a button, no extra tools needed. And it's also super easy to make builds and export cartridges as well. You can just type in a command and get it within seconds. It's also just really cool to see what people can do in spite of these limitations. On the left here is Micro-8, which is a fantasy console within PICO-8. Absolutely insane. Here is Poom, which is an ongoing project to port Doom into this 8-bit environment, which is also equally incredible. As you'll see, all of this has been drawn from personal experience. For the potato thing, I worked on Pushimo on a crummy laptop for basically the whole time because I didn't have access to my desktop at that time. So I'd been working on another game for a while, and I felt like things are moving slowly. It turns out making games are hard. Around the same time, I was playing a lot with tweet carts, which are these really cool animations that fit inside a tweet, 280 characters. And an indie dev I follow just released this really cool game, Mixolumia, which made me want to make my own block falling game. And so this was sort of a perfect storm because right at the same time was Low Res Jam, where you make a game in 64 by 64 pixels. Pushimo, if you're not familiar with it, is an arcade push 'em up. You control a character, you push blocks into squares to clear them and earn points. So I joined Low Res Jam and I was able to get it up and running pretty quick. I had it up and playable in the first week. And the only reason it wasn't ready sooner is because I was supposed to be taking a break from development on account of not making any progress with Golf NATO. But after the jam, it just kept sitting in my mind and growing at me. I knew I wanted to take it further, and I had a pretty clear vision for what I wanted out of it. I wanted to be able to change the rules of the game with small changes to create very different feelings. This example has a small change. You shrink the play space, which creates a feeling that is called despair. So I got to work. I had my core vision, and I knew I needed to work on adding new modes and a lot of polish. So I knew I wouldn't have room to do much more than this because of the space constraints. So I gave myself the deadline of Siege, which is now, to avoid development hell. And I made really good progress really fast. I had about everything I had planned in about a month in, so I could add more, right? No, that's scope creep. So instead of that, I focused heavily on testing and polishing what I already had. I found I was even making too much progress week to week for to share it once a week on Screenshot Saturday. So I ended up doing daily GIF updates, which ended up working out, but it was super hard to keep up. Social media manager is a full-time job by itself. Follow me at Neuro Diversion. It's really hard to gauge how much this helped, because most of these daily updates didn't get a lot of interaction, but it still meant that it was kept fresh into people's minds and on their feeds. I was also able to do several playtests, I think 4 and 5 in total, and I got tons of feedback from this. This is a huge part of why I think it turned out so good, because I was constantly asking people how it could be even better. I know many people watching were involved in testing this, so thank you so much for all of your help. And these two bullets are worth a full talk on their own. So it's definitely worth stating that it wouldn't be the game it is if I couldn't share things so easily or do playtests as easily. I also got a lot of help from PICO-8's great community. I got some help with some critical bugs that turned up, and for sound effects, I was able to look at what other games were doing and use that as inspiration for the own sound effects in my game. This is where everything being open was super helpful, because I could look at this how they made the sounds, because otherwise I'd kind of be at a loss for how to replicate them. And then lastly, there are two music tracks in the game. One was made by Gruber, which is part of a set of several tracks, which are all intended specifically for developers to put in their games for free, which is really awesome. And the second was made by one of my best friends. And lastly, there are some ways in which you can surpass these limits that I did utilize. This is coming back to that asterisk way earlier, if you remember. So first, you only have up to 16 colors on screen at once, but you have up to 32 to choose from. So there's this sort of secret palette. You have colors 0 to 15, and then 128 to 143 is the secret palette. So you can pick 16 from these to use. And next is the trick called multi-carting. So you can make multiple carts and load them, load one another from in-game. The code, size, and sprite and sound limitations all apply to each cart individually, but separating them out lets you have more stuff in total. For example, there's the 8,000 token limit. The core for Pushimo is 7,000 tokens. The tutorial is 1,000. All the extra game modes are another 1,000. But since the tutorial doesn't know about the extra game modes, each cart only still has 8,000 on their own. So I've spent the last 25 odd minutes building up fantasy consoles. It's worth bringing up some ways the constraints aren't as helpful. These are some issues you'll run into out of the box. Many of these are solvable, but they require more work, and critically, they require space to fix. If you want to get past these, you got to implement it, which will just give you less space for other things. Questions are coming up soon, so go ahead and start putting those in chat. So the big one here is accessibility concerns. The default print command uses this 3x5 font, which is really bad for clarity. Look at this M next to this N. Look at this O next to this 0. This one is solvable. There are resources people made for bigger fonts, but there's also the issue of screen real estate. This is from the tutorial, and this is already like a pretty short snippet, but it takes up so much of the screen just because there's so little space. The control scheme is also awkward for many people. By default, it's arrow keys and Z and X, which people aren't gonna figure out on their own. I ended up having to have flashing text here at the bottom to tell people that. This one is also solvable but awkward because you can use keyboard input, but you have to enable it with a command, and then you have to still parse it. You can also use mouse input, but you also need a command, and then you're awkwardly switching between mouse and keyboard. For some reason, every game likes to be super loud by default. This applies to everything ever, basically, not just PICO-8. But the issue is magnified with it just because of the limited control you have. Here is one sound effect, and you only have 8 options for the volume level, and that's it. This one isn't very solvable. You don't have a way to just like lower the volume of sound effects or music. Basically, all you can do is the system level volume control. If you care about selling your works, this is very relevant too. I want to open first with the status quo financially devalues indie games far below their actual value. Someone named Sissy wrote a great article about pricing hobby games that I absolutely recommend everyone check out. I'll share that in the chat a little bit later. Basically, putting a price tag on your game asserts its value. People are more likely to give it a look if it has a higher perceived value. There is some, but not a lot, of precedent for selling games made in PICO-8 or other fantasy consoles. Chroma Cannon is a game in the Pixel Sessions bundle, which is 5 super stylized small games for $3. Notimon and Sakura Stars are both PICO-8 games on Steam. But there's not very many more examples than this. It's also just kind of given that by working in this space, you're going to have a more niche, limited audience than you would otherwise. Celeste was prototyped in PICO-8, but for the full release, it was brought into Unity, and there's no way it would have seen the same success and the same appeal if it was built in PICO-8. This one isn't so significant. Working in groups, be careful with version control because you might have conflicts since everything is stored in one file. Here's one that will come up unless you can make a game without any bugs. PICO-8 doesn't have very comprehensive debugging tools, but also it doesn't really need it. You can pause the game at any time and bring up a command line. You can use this to change variables or call functions or print information, etc. It requires you to think a bit more, but it ends up being powerful and versatile enough to do whatever you need it to, if you're able to think that way. And you also have tools to check how much space do you have, how long your code is executing, etc. So you have everything you need to optimize. Lastly, it's up to you to decide how important this information is. A lot of this talk was written with a consideration of making a full game in PICO-8, but it's not my goal to convince any of you to make your next game in a fantasy console. In fact, I think it's a little bit silly to commit to something like that. It's a whole heck of a lot of fun, but you don't have to get that far to reach the fun. More than anything else, I think PICO-8 is kind of like a toy box where you can find and make your own fun. It gives you the space and tools you need for that. You can do this by making a fully fledged $5 game by Pushimo on itch, You can do that by spending a whole weekend making a little jam project. You could do that by taking an afternoon and making some super small stuff. You don't even have to make anything to have fun. You can lose yourself in all the wonderful little games created by this awesome community. And if you think any of that sounds fun, I implore you to give it a try. And thank you for coming to my book report. Are there any questions?
Great stuff, man. Much appreciated. A lot of praise in chat for it. A few questions. First of all, you talked a little bit about avoiding scope creep, but going into polishing. This is a problem I see a number of new devs have, being able to tell the difference between polish and scope creep, where they'll think they're polishing and actually they're adding more content that ends up really holding them back. Any thoughts on, for you, what meant you were polishing instead of adding?
I guess my gut would say is if it's something that you would want to put like on a features list, then it would be new content or a new feature versus if it's just taking what you already have and making it look or feel better, then that would be polish.
Very cool. Akabalan Atiani says that was an awesome presentation. I have another question because I was developing games before 1996. And one of the things we often had to do, and I actually really liked doing, was memory mapping out where everything would go. And of course, we would often create a memory map and not follow it like we should. Is this something you need to do for the fantasy platforms?
There is a memory map in PICO-8 at least. So you can see the whole memory map has everything, including the sprite sheet, including the code, including the current screen space, and some permanent memory stuff and others and everything else. So, and you do have access to all of that with these sort of poke and peek functions. So you can totally get super deep into it if you wanted to, but also doesn't really ever require you to do that.
All right, excellent. We had another question from D. Burgundy. After making Pushimo, do you feel like you've mastered PICO-8 as a tool, or is there more to learn?
Definitely not, considering some of the awesome work other people have been making. There's a bunch of 3D stuff people are making in PICO-8, which is boggling my mind how you can do all of that in this little system. And there's plenty of other examples that I could point to that I don't know off the top of my head.
All right. Great, great, great. Puzzles by Joe says, great shout out. Many, many thanks. Then he quotes one of my mantras without credit, which actually didn't originate with Joe anyway. But we all agree perfect is the enemy of good, unless you have $100 million to spend on your game. So, that was excellent.